Good day, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of the International Code Council, the California Building Officials, and the California Building Standards Commission, I would like to welcome you to this California Code Adoption for Local Jurisdictions webinar. This webinar addresses the local adoption process in California. With the new codes being adopted and published in California, jurisdictions have until January 2017 to complete local amendment ordinances and file them with the California Building Standards Commission. This presentation provides important information that will help code officials navigate the laws and regulations pertaining to this process. It includes sample documents for a staff report, justification, and an adoption ordinance. The 2015 code books are available for purchase at the website shown on the screen. This link will be shown again at the end of the presentation. Additional links will also be shown that will provide access to several useful resources that are provided by the California Building Standards Commission to assist code officials in completing the local adoption process. We begin today with some opening remarks from Mia Marvelli, Executive Director of the Building Standards Commission, followed by our feature presenter, Stuart Tom, Fire Marshal and former Chief Building Official for the City of Glendale, California. First, I would like to welcome Mia Marvelli. Ms. Marvelli was appointed the California Building Standards Commission Executive Director in February 2016. She joined the CBSC in 2012 with 20 years of prior state service, including the Department of Water Resources and the Department of General Services Real Estate Services Division. Prior to appointment as Executive Director, Ms. Marvelli served as an Associate Architect administering the processes related to the adoption, approval, publication, and implementation of California's building codes. In addition, she developed building standards and green building standard regulations on behalf of the CBSC. During her tenure with the Department of Water Resources and General Services, Ms. Marvelli developed construction drawings for new state facilities and for the renovation of existing state-owned facilities in compliance with the California Building Standards Commission. Please welcome Executive Director Mia Marvelli.
Hello, I am Mia Marvelli, Executive Director of the California Building Standards Commission, and I'm very pleased to be participating in this California Code Adoption for Local Jurisdictions workshop. CBSC received positive feedback from its first edition, and I know the second edition of this webinar will prove to be just as beneficial for local jurisdictions. I would like to express my gratitude to all who have made this possible. CBSC's expectation is that local jurisdictions will benefit from the updated information provided in this workshop, helping to reduce uncertainty and questions which may arise during their ordinance development and local filing processes. CBSC's purpose for providing this training is to empower the local jurisdictions to educate themselves on the state's requirements for the development and filing of ordinances. In turn, this reduces our staff time expended addressing questions and concerns from local jurisdictions regarding the ordinance process, subject to the California Health and Safety Code requirements. We are looking forward to a meaningful and productive workshop and believe that webinars such as these provide an easy vehicle for education and outreach opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Marvelli. Next, I would like to introduce our featured speaker, Mr. Stuart Tom. Mr. Tom is the Fire Marshal and former Chief Building Official for the City of Glendale, California. He has been a registered engineer in the states of Washington and California for more than 25 years and is very active in code development of fire and life safety standards at both the national and state levels. Due to his commitment to safety, he was selected as the state's Building Official of the Year by the California Building Officials Association in 2006 and was again selected as Building Official of the Year in 2009 by the California Fire Chiefs Association Fire Prevention Officers. He is the only person to receive such award by both organizations. In 2015, he was elected to the International Code Council Board of Directors. Please welcome Mr. Stuart Tom.
Let's talk about the objectives for this morning. Upon completion, participants will be better able to do the following. First, identify the California codes in Title 24, the California Building Standards Code. Second, participants will be able to describe the local adoption process and the legal authorities relating to that process. Next, describe the California code adoption timeline, including local adoption timeframe, which places you where you should be in order to get this done on time. Next, describe the common mistakes frequently made with the code adoption process. And determine whether local amendments must also be certified by the California Energy Commission. So, is it really time to adopt the code again? Doesn't it seem like things have settled down a bit and we've been using the I-codes for a while now? Is California proposing many changes to the model codes? How much of your current locally adopted code will be reusable? You probably think you know what you're doing. Have you been doing it right? So, for today's topics, we will be listing the codes that you will be adopting, and this is important because you have to actually address them in your local adoption ordinance. We'll go over a local adoption process and legal authorities to make sure that you are aware of exactly which statutes empower you to do what you need to do to protect your communities. We're going to go over a timeline, and this timeline will show you where we are today, where you need to be in order to get things done on time, and show you how to get there. We'll briefly go through what's new for 2016 to make sure that your adoption is compliant with the current regulations, and we'll go through some frequent mistakes. So, let's start by getting into Title 24. What is Title 24 of the California Code of Regulations? Title 24 is the Building Standards Code for the state. It's organized into 12 separate parts. Part 1 is the California Administrative Code. Part 2 is the California Building Code. Part 2.5 is the California Residential Code. Part 3 is the California Electrical Code. Part 4 is the California Mechanical Code. Part 5 is the California Plumbing Code. Part 6 is the state's Energy Code. Part 7 is not currently used. Part 8 is the California State Historic Building Code. Part 9 is the State Fire Code. Part 10, which is very important, so I want you to pay attention to it, is the California Existing Buildings Code. And the manner in which California will be using Part 10 is slightly different this year, and we'll get into that later on. Part 11 is the California Green Building Code, or Cal Green, and Part 12 is the California Reference Standards Code. So let's get into the local codes and local amendment statutory laws which govern how we go through the code adoption process. There are 3 parts of the California Health and Safety Code that you should be aware of. Those are 17958, which governs the state housing law and the adoption and amendment regulations pertaining thereto. Health and Safety Code 18941.5, which is often referred to as the Building Standards Law, and this has similar statutory language which identifies what your responsibilities are in terms of amending and adopting your local building code. And then Health and Safety Code 13869 deals with fire protection districts. And for those of you that have responsibilities pertaining to fire protection in fire protection districts, this is the state statute which authorizes you to have local amendments to better protect your communities. Now, local jurisdictions must adopt the California Building Standards Code for local enforcement within 180 days after Title 24 is published. In adopting Title 24 for your local enforcement, your jurisdiction may amend those standards if those amendments are reasonably necessary to protect your communities because of a local geologic, topographic, or climatic condition. A copy of these standards, Health and Safety Code 17958, Health and Safety Code 18941.5, and Health and Safety Code 13869 are included in the handout, and for those that are viewing this online, a link will be provided so that you can download these handouts as well. I want to talk very briefly about administrative standards versus building standards. And this is important because only changes to building standards need to be justified on the basis of a local geologic, topographic, or climatic condition. Establishment of administrative standards do not require justification pursuant to those statutes. So if you have a standard that is not a building standard, it's administrative in nature. Perhaps your jurisdiction has certain time frames to issue building permits, you establish fees, there are certain administrative procedures that you follow. You can have local amendments to address those, and you do not need to justify those on a basis of a geologic, topographic, or climatic condition. But if in order to protect your community, you do have standards that deal with the manner in which buildings are constructed, those would be building standards, and you do need to justify those. So, when do you need to adopt a local code? As I mentioned before, adoption must take place within 180 days of Title 24 publication. You may not adopt your local code before Title 24 is published. Most jurisdictions deliberately time their adoption ordinances to become effective exactly 180 days after Title 24 publication or upon the established effective date of the state code. It may be adopted later than 180 days, but during the interim period of time, the unamended Title 24 standards must be enforced. I'd like to point out this actually occurs fairly frequently as a result of delayed adoption of a code. Sometimes your jurisdiction might be delayed in adopting a code because it has special standards, green standards or other standards that you want to spend a little bit more time scrutinizing. If that results in a delay in passing an ordinance, it's okay. But during that period of time, after which the state code becomes effective throughout California until your ordinance takes effect, the unamended Title 24 standards do govern construction in your community. So, when does your governing body meet? This is important to consider, and we're going to go over it in the timeline because some local ordinances require 2 readings by your city council or your county council. Some governing bodies only meet on Tuesdays or Wednesdays. They may meet once a week, twice a month, and so forth. And depending on the frequency by which your governing body meets, this will determine when you have to take certain steps in your local adoption process. So, this is the adoption timeline. And as you can see, today, April 28th, we are right here on the timeline. Looks like there's a lot going on, and I want to go through each of these different segments of the timeline to let you know how we got to where we are and show you where we want to be and how to get there. So it all started when the 2015 version of the model codes were first published. The model codes that we're looking at for this particular code adoption cycle are the 2015 editions of the international codes, the 2015 editions of certain IAPMO codes here in California, and the 2014 National Electric Code. Those codes have already been published, of course, and once they were published, the state agencies that are involved in amendment of those model codes to become the California Building Standards Code immediately started taking a look at them, comparing how the new codes stacked up to what we already had in the state of California. And they started what's referred to as the California rulemaking process. Those state agencies developed their rulemaking package, which consisted at that time, early on in the development, with draft express terms and something referred to as an initial statement of reasons. After those documents were generated and made available to the public to look at and comment on, there were certain review periods in which interested parties and stakeholders could take a look at what the state was proposing to amend from those model codes into Title 24. And starting on August 14th of 2015, those comment periods started. There were actually 4 45-day comment periods starting from August 14th and spanning all the way through November 23rd of 2015. And depending on the nature of those comments, they may have generated subsequent 15-day comment periods. Those 4 45-day comment periods included 2 45-day comment periods by the Access Committee, one by the Building, Fire, and Other, and Structural Design Committee, and then one by the Green and PEME Committee. Once those comments were received and reviewed by the state agencies, they generated 6 subsequent 15-day comment periods. Those started on October 28th and spanned through December 29th. Of those 6, there were 1 15-day comment period by the Access Committee. There were 3 15-day comment periods by Building, Fire, and Other and the Structural Design Committee, and then there were 2 15-day comment periods by the Green and PEME Committee. For those that are active in code development and take a look at those draft standards to assist the state agencies in developing what ultimately becomes the standards for our state building code, that is where all of this takes place. This is where the bulk of the development of state codes occurs. Okay, as I mentioned, this is where the bulk of the work occurred. There were 2 very important dates at the end of last year. December 16th and January 19th of this year were the final hearings. And at that time, on December 16th of 2015, the I-codes were basically adopted with the final amendments, and the IAPMO codes, Green Code, Historic Code, Energy Code, and Accessibility Codes were considered for final consideration on January 19th. At that time, the California Building Standards Commission finished their rulemaking process by producing what's referred to as the final express terms and a final statement of reasons. As a result of those public hearings, those final rulemaking documents were made publicly available, and they were sent to the Secretary of State for final codification. That took place, and it led to February 9th of 2016. That was an important date because upon that date, filing with the Secretary of State, publication can finally begin. So, on February 9th, 2016, the codes were sent to the publisher. At this point, short of any minor tweaks to the code, they are locked. The final results of all that rulemaking package had already been codified, sent to the Secretary of State, and many individuals had already secured copies of those final express terms, and they have commenced their review so that they would have an idea where they wanted to go with their local code adoption. Most people, however, wait until those codes are published and made available to them, which doesn't occur until right around this date, July 1st, 2016, because that is the scheduled release date by the state of California for the California Building Standards Code. And it is on schedule, should be released on July 1st of this year. At this point, this is where most of the work of local jurisdictions generally takes place. This is the Title 24 statutory period between publication and the final effective date in which your locally adopted code takes effect. This is the period of time in which, if there are reasonably necessary amendments for you to protect your community, which you can justify on the basis of a local geologic, topographic, or climatic condition, you can make those changes, submit them to your governing body for consideration and review, and if they are adopted, then finally on this date, January 1st, 2017, that's when the new code will take effect. On this date, if you do have a locally amended version of the code in effect for your jurisdiction, it will take effect on this date. If you have not completed that process by that time, the state's Building Standards Code, Title 24, will be in effect at that time. So let's take a look at what it takes in order to amend the code. I've got a date right here in the timeline, November 29th, 2016, and I'll tell you what the significance of that is. Our jurisdiction, the City of Glendale, California, our council meets every Tuesday. Depending on what your jurisdiction does, you can determine an appropriate date in a similar fashion. Since we meet every Tuesday, it turns out that November 29th, 2016 is the very last Tuesday prior to January 1st, which has at least 30 days so that that ordinance can take effect without requiring an urgency clause. So on this date, November 29th, this is actually my last chance in order to have my city council adopt an ordinance, have a 30-day period of time, and have it take effect on or before January 1st. If I schedule anything after this date for my city, I will miss that date, and the effective date would end up being after January 1st. So I'm going to target as the very last date that my city council can adopt that ordinance, November 29th. Since we require 2 readings by our city council for every ordinance, the meeting right before that, which would be a Tuesday, would be the date on which our ordinance would be introduced to the public for the first time before the council could take their subsequent action on the 29th. You'll notice, however, that the date that I choose, November 15th, is more than 7 days before November 29th. It's actually 2 weeks before. This is done intentionally to ensure that I have a slight cushion, because as we all know, things happen. Things can get bumped from an agenda. A meeting might get canceled. And by virtue of the fact that I don't want to take any chances, and I want to make sure that my council can still take their action on November 29th, I will schedule the initial reading of this ordinance on November 15th. This is not required for you to do, but it is very, very good practice to give yourself a cushion of at least 1 meeting by your governing body, so that if something beyond your control occurs, you're still on schedule, so that you'll have 30 days prior to January 1st. The next date that's important for me is October 19th. The significance of this date is that in the city of Glendale, like most of your jurisdictions, we have a Building and Safety Commission. Our commission meets on Wednesdays, and they only meet once a month. So if I want to have a public, open, and transparent process where I can solicit input from stakeholders within my community, I'm also going to want to present it to the public before I present an ordinance to the City Council. So therefore, October 19th is the last Wednesday, since my commission meets on Wednesdays, prior to that November 15th meeting. So on this date, Wednesday, October 19th, I am shooting for my Building and Safety Commission to make a recommendation to our City Council to adopt the ordinance that I'm going to present. So this is a very important date. But just like the City Council, we do have an open and transparent process. I want our commissioners and any stakeholders that show up to have the opportunity to review the proposed local amendments and present to us any suggestions or questions that they may have. And for that reason, the meeting right before that, which is Wednesday, September 21st, is when I will present to the Building and Safety Commission for the City of Glendale our proposed local amendments for the first time. In effect, September 21st will be the first time that the public in my community will have a full view of all of the local amendments that I'm proposing for our community. Any input that I get from them will be considered. If I need to make any adjustments, it will be presented back to them the following meeting on October 19th, at which point, if they recommend approval to the council, I will submit it for the initial reading by our City Council on November 15th, scheduled for adoption of that ordinance November 29th, and then on January 1st, it will take effect. So, what does that mean to all of you? Well, let's take a look at it. As I mentioned, July 1st is actually the date that the California Building Standards Code will be published. So if we use that date as a marker and measure to January 1st, that's 184 days. But if you take away weekends and holidays, that leaves you only 125 days in order to get the entire process done. That's 125 working days from when the code is published and can be in your hands to when that ordinance needs to take effect. As I mentioned to you, however, I need to have that ready November 15th in order to see to it that our Building and Safety Commission can approve it and recommend to our council that they adopt that. So if I measure from July 1st to that November 15th date, it's only 137 days. Once again, taking out weekends and holidays, I'm down to 94 days to get all this work done. And then finally, if I go back to September 21st, which is when I actually have to have my local adoption package completed, so that in an open and transparent process, I can allow all stakeholders in my community to review it, make suggestions, and ask questions, and present it to the Building and Fire Commission for input. From July 1st to that September 21st date, I'm down to 82 calendar days, taking away weekends and holidays. I only have 56 days to get all this work done. So as you can see, from July 1st to September 21st, there's not a lot of time. That's why I pointed out on the timeline that the final express terms have already been published. And if you want to get a head start, you can go to the Building Standards Commission website, download those express terms, marry it up with a copy of the international codes, and you actually have the ability to see right now, today, what will be in the California building codes. Okay, so what do local code amendments look like? First, they follow the same format as Title 24. The language should look very similar. It's best to use the same section numbering scheme and sequence. I know that some jurisdictions have special numbering to make sure that their local building codes match up with different code sections in their respective municipal codes. If possible, it is always recommended that the numbering scheme match what's in Title 24. The amendments to building standards may not be less protective than Title 24. They may be more protective if it's necessary. And there is more flexibility when amending non-building standards and administrative standards. And later on, we'll go over some examples. So, what do justifications look like? Well, generally, the best format is simply to use clear text that simply explains that an amendment is necessary to adequately protect the community on the basis of a specific local geologic, topographic, or climatic condition. Now, it's not acceptable to merely state that an amendment is necessary due to, quote, a local geologic condition. You actually have to identify what that local condition is. Each amendment requires justification. A particular justification may be used repeatedly. This is something that is not fully understood. You can use the same justification over and over and over again. For example, if your community requires special local amendments due to the severe seismicity in this state, that same justification, if your community is close to active faults, can be used over and over again to explain why certain structural provisions have been updated. A justification does not need to be unique to a particular justification. Clearly, communities that are close to each other will experience similar geologic, topographic, and climatic conditions, and therefore justifications can be similar. And we will go through some examples of justifications in a moment. So let's talk about the state agency amendments. When you get a copy of the California Building Standards Code, in square brackets, you will see that there are lots of different provisions of the code that have been amended. The state agencies that will affect you most are HCD1, HCD2, SFM, DSA-AC, and OSHPD 3. HCD1 is the Division of Housing and Community Development that has statutory authority over hotels, apartments, condominiums, and of course single-family dwellings. For those of you that have mobile home parks, HCD2 is the Division of Housing and Community Development that regulates those areas. The State Fire Marshal's Office has broad authority over Group A, C, E, H, I, L, and R occupancies, high-rise buildings, and other buildings that are utilized by the state of California. Division of the State Architect Access Compliance Unit deals with disabled access. And then OSHPOD deals with licensed clinics and outpatient services. So, what are the key elements of a local code adoption ordinance? Is there a particular format that must be followed? Can all the codes be adopted in a single ordinance, or is a separate ordinance required for each code? For example, a separate ordinance just for the building code, or just for the residential code, or fire code, and so forth. We'll talk about that in a bit, but before we move on, I do want to point out that there is a new code that most of you will be adopting this term, and it is the California Existing Buildings Code. That's Part 10 of Title 24, and we will definitely be talking about that later. So how important is it that local jurisdictions adopt similar codes? In the interest of simplifying things for all of your customers, of course, it is desirable to have codes that are similar to neighboring jurisdictions, but as is necessary for you to reasonably protect your community, you need to do what is appropriate for your community in considering your local amendment ordinance. Is bigger and stronger always better? You know, not necessarily, but some jurisdictions do think that having a bigger, stronger code with certain provisions is desirable, and if that is what your community wants to do, work with your elected officials. Do local codes always have to be greener or more energy efficient than the state code? Your community doesn't ever have to be greener or more efficient than the state code, but if you do change those provisions, they should be more stringent than the code. They can never be less stringent than the code. What about codes from neighboring jurisdictions? Do you need to be better or greener than they are? A lot of communities like to advertise that they are one of the greener communities. Work with your local elected officials to determine what direction that they need to go in, and the rest of this presentation will help you get there depending on what direction you've been given. How does the increased cost of compliance fit into code adoption decisions? Certainly something that you need to consider in your ordinance. So, elements of adoption. Your adoption must be done by your governing body. This is very important because all amendments must be adopted by ordinance. A department policy is not sufficient. I'd like to point out the second bullet here. Contract cities must adopt their own code even if adoption is by reference. This is very important for those communities that don't have their own building department, their own fire prevention bureau, and so forth, that rely upon contract cities perhaps from the county in which they reside. While you might be relying upon the county building code or the county fire code, you must locally adopt that, even if it's just by reference for your own community. You must include each standard that will be amended in that ordinance. I'd like to point out that once again, Assembly Bill 210 does allow green building standards to be locally amended as building standards. Special attention must be afforded to those green building standards which also influence energy efficiency. This is something that some communities forget. In their earnest to adjust green building and sustainability standards in their community, they might make a change that increases energy efficiency. While that's a great thing, you do need to point out that if it does affect energy efficiency, those amendments do need to be certified by the California Energy Commission. And I'll talk about that later on. Amendments must be reasonably necessary because of a local climatic, geologic, or topographic condition. And then the last thing that I'd like to point out is that the appendices are actually not part of Title 24 unless they were expressly adopted by the Building Standards Commission or one of the state agencies. And so if there is an appendix that is desirable to your community, which was not expressly adopted into the state codes, you need to include that in your local adoption ordinance. New for 2017, this code cycle, there are a couple things, and most people are aware of it, but I do want to go over it very quickly. Assembly Bill 2188 did have local provisions intended to facilitate compliance with an expedited, streamlined permit and inspection process for solar photovoltaic systems. And so if you include that in your ordinance, AB 2188 would have been what drove that. Those are generally administrative standards because they pertain to the timing and the speed at which administrative permits are issued, and they may include certain aspects of fees, which are also non-building standards. Assembly Bill 1236 had local provisions intended to facilitate compliance with an expedited, streamlined permit and inspection process for EV charging stations, very similar to Assembly Bill 2188. And once again, these generally fall into administrative standards, not building standards, and therefore you do not need to justify those on the basis of one of those local geologic, climatic, or topographic conditions. The last bullet on this slide, buildings constructed under prior codes, very, very important. As some of you may be aware, Title 24, Part 10 now adopts portions of the international existing buildings code with certain California amendments included. This is very important because Chapter 34 has now been eliminated from the International Building Code. So therefore, the standards that we've all been accustomed to in dealing with remodeling or additions, projects of that nature for existing buildings went away. It's no longer in Chapter 34 of the Building Code. It's now been replaced with Part 10 of Title 24, the IEBC, and I'll be talking about that later on. Each jurisdiction should review the applicable provisions adopted into Part 10 of Title 24 and make local adjustments if they are necessary. I would like to remind a lot of people that typically purchase certain codes for their jurisdictions. Don't forget, you're going to want to add one book to your purchase list for all of your staff this year, and that's going to be the IEBC. If you forget to purchase that code, you won't have the standards that you need in order to deal with existing construction this year. Okay, a couple things that are really important. I have provided assistance with a number of jurisdictions in helping them with their ordinances, and I often see these neglected or omitted. And one deals with repeal of prior code. It is very, very useful within your ordinance to have a provision which indicates that the prior code is expressly being repealed. It's often overlooked by municipalities, and it's critically important to ensure that obsolete provisions are expressly repealed. If you had an ordinance which adopted or established certain provisions for your jurisdiction, and you did not have within that ordinance an automatic sunset clause, if you don't repeal it, those provisions are still on the books. They're still law in your jurisdiction. So the easiest way to make sure that you don't have obsolete standards is to include a provision in your ordinance which repeals a previous code. Another important aspect is references to prior code. Include a provision that expressly indicates that prior references to the formal local code shall be construed to apply to the corresponding provisions of the proposed local code once your new ordinance takes effect. This becomes very, very important because virtually every jurisdiction cites code sections and code additions or versions on countless forms that are floating around in your departments, and they still reference these old codes. If you don't have a reference to a prior code included in your ordinance, all of those forms are actually going to be pointing to the wrong code. So justifications. What are the key elements of a local jurisdiction's justification to amend the code? And is there a particular format that must be followed? Can all amendments just be justified at the same time? And when is a jurisdiction required to justify their amendments. Well, administrative standards, as I mentioned before, do not require justification, but building standards, including green building standards, do need justification on the basis of a local climatic, geologic, or topographic condition. There is no mandated format for the justification as long as the findings are individually and expressly made by the governing body, and a council resolution is a formal express method that is simple and clean. And this is the process that's used by most jurisdictions. So what ends up happening is their governing body adopts an ordinance which is followed by a resolution which identifies the justification for all of those amendments. So, pursuant to Health and Safety Code, the governing body of a city or county, before making any modifications or changes pursuant to Section 17958.5, shall make express finding that such modifications or changes are reasonably necessary because of local climatic, geologic, or topographical conditions. This is taken directly out of the Health and Safety Code, and I do want to draw your attention to this right here, which states, before making any modifications or changes. Some legal counsels in certain jurisdictions will tell you that the justifications have to come first by virtue of Health and Safety Code. That being the case, since your either county council or city council can take whichever action they want in order, it is recommended that if there is a resolution with justifications, that they enter that into the record first. They read that first. Such a finding shall be available as a public record, so make sure that after the action is taken, that the public does have access to the resolution as well as the ordinance. And then a copy of those findings, together with the modification or change, expressly marked and identified to which each finding refers. Each amendment must be individually justified. So if you have 30 amendments for your jurisdiction, you actually will have 30 justifications. When it's completed, justifications must be filed along with the amendments with the California Building Standards Commission. This is the address where you send it, to the California Building Standards Commission, 2525 Natomas Park Drive, Suite 130 in Sacramento. You can actually file it online at that address. Certified mail with return receipt requested is recommended so that you do have a record of when it was submitted. The Building Standards Commission will acknowledge receipt of your package when they get it. They will not evaluate the justifications or the amendments to determine whether or not they're reasonable or acceptable. They are simply a filing body, and they will keep a copy of that on record. Once it is filed with them, anybody requesting a copy can get a copy of your local amendments and the justifications therefore from the Building Standards Commission. So let's go through some sample documents very quickly. The sample documents that you all have in front of you, and for those that are viewing this on the webinar, there will be a link to get copies of these same handouts, which will include a sample City Council staff report, sample justification resolution, just excerpts from it, which will include a cover page, a matrix, and a key that I'll go over in a bit. Sample adoption ordinance. The excerpts of that ordinance will include a cover page, several important aspects of adoption. The handouts will also include a brand new Building Standards Bulletin 14-02, which refers to a guide for local amendments and filings of building standards. And then also we'll have reference to this California Codes Adoption webinar, and a link will be placed on the California Building Standards Commission website. The handouts also include something very useful. As I mentioned earlier, if your jurisdiction amends any provisions that affect energy efficiency, you do have to have those provisions certified by the California Energy Commission. And I do have some sample documents that show how that is done. It's a relatively simple process. And most importantly, I have a portion of a cost effectiveness study, because that is a required component. and the CEC will not certify your amendments if you do not include a cost effectiveness study. So let's go through some of those handouts. This is the cover sheet for a typical staff report that I have used in the past for adoption of local amendments and resolutions. You'll indicate, as I mentioned before, we time these so that it takes effect the final Tuesday, leaving at least 30 days left. So you can see back in 2007, this occurred back on November 27th. That was the ideal council date for this to take effect. You'll notice that I had two things on the agenda for the City Council that evening. One was an ordinance for adoption and amending specific provisions of the California Building Standards Code. And number two, I had a resolution adopting those findings of fact, which justified those amendments to the California Building Standards Code. I do want to point something out because this is very important. Oftentimes people, in preparing their ordinance, they will make reference to the international building codes or various other model codes. Since in the state of California, your duty is to adopt the California Building Standards Code and amend that, you do need to make sure that what you are referring to is indeed the California Building Standards Code. So, as I mentioned, when this actually went to council, we introduced the resolution first to make sure that we were exactly in line with health and safety code. So this is what was presented first, and this was indeed the resolution. It was a resolution of the Council of the City of Glendale adopting legislative findings supporting amendments and changes to the California State Building Standards Code as contained in the Glendale Building and Safety Code for the year 2008. That resolution included with it a matrix. This is perhaps the easiest way to identify and individually and expressly identify every single amendment and individually identify every single justification. In this particular matrix, you'll see that in the left-hand column, I identified every single code section that I was amending, and this went on for several pages. The next column merely had the title of that particular section of the code. And then probably most important is the far right column, where I had a reference to a particular justification. And you'll see that in that column, I indicated that the justification was represented by A, B, C, or D. And I've got a key that I'll show you in just a moment. But before we move on, what I did to identify whether or not something was being added to the code, being deleted from the code, or being included but amended, I included these three columns right here. Okay. The resolution concluded with a key, and this is where each of those individually and expressly identified justifications is identified. So on that prior matrix where I identified every single amendment and I identified which justifications pertain to each one, this key made it very, very clear. So as a very simple example, if you were to take a look at justification B, for example, this amendment is justified on the basis of a local geologic condition. The city is subject to earthquake hazards caused by its location in the Sierra Madre Fault near the base of the San Gabriel Mountains. Said fault is the eastward extension of the same fault upon which the 1971 San Fernando earthquake originated. Other faults which potentially could cause seismic activity in the city include the Verdugo Fault and so on. You'll notice that justification C deals with local climatic conditions. The seasonal climatic conditions during the late summer and fall create severe fire hazards to the public health and welfare of the city. The hot, dry weather in combination with Santa Ana winds, et cetera, due to the climatic weather patterns that the city is subject to, we have certain justifications there. And then finally, D deals with topographic conditions. Glendale topography includes significant hillsides with narrow and winding access, which makes timely response by fire suppression vehicles difficult. Additionally, long periods of dry, hot weather combined with unpredictable seasonal winds result in increased exposure to fire risk. The modifications and additions to the California Code are reasonably necessary to combat the hazards brought about by local climatic conditions, and so on. This was the ordinance. This immediately followed the resolution, and there are some important things that I do want to point out. As I mentioned earlier, some people question, are you allowed to adopt and amend every single code all in one ordinance, or do you need a separate one? You can do it either way. We adopt all of our codes in one ordinance. We just have different sections and volumes. So volume 1 in ours are the building standards, and this is where we adopt and amend the California building code. And we have other sections for the mechanical code, electrical code, fire code, and so on. This particular page of the ordinance is important because I've got a couple of interesting things that I do want to recommend that local jurisdictions consider. Number one, down here, references to prior codes. As I mentioned before, this is an important thing to include in a local adoption ordinance to make sure that any prior references are dispensed with properly. And so you'll see that we have a section in our ordinance that we adopt every 3 years, which states, unless superseded and expressly repealed, references in city forms, documents, and regulations to the chapters and sections of the former Glendale Building and Safety Code, 2002 that year, shall be construed to apply to the corresponding provisions contained within the Glendale Building and Safety Code 2008. And Ordinance 5329 was the number of that particular ordinance. I want to point out a couple of other important things to include in an ordinance: severability and effective date. We do put a provision in the code that if any provision of the ordinance or the application thereof to any person or circumstance is held to be invalid, that the rest of it is still valid. No one's perfect. There are errors in ordinances, and it is important to make sure that if there is a portion of it that is invalid, the rest of it does remain in effect. The effective date, the provisions of the Glendale Building and Safety Code 2008 shall be enforced on or after the date upon which this ordinance becomes effective. We went ahead and identified the effective date. This ordinance becomes effect and shall be enforced on January 1st, 2008. You are allowed to identify the specific date upon which your ordinance takes effect, and since we were more than 30 days before January 1st, we were able to identify January 1st as the date upon which that takes effect. As I mentioned before, appendices are not included in Title 24 unless they're expressly identified, and there are certain appendices that your jurisdiction might find valuable. Glendale is the same. So as you can see, there were certain appendix chapters that we expressly identified that we were including and also amending some of those provisions as well. An interesting provision that we put here that a number of jurisdictions in California utilize, and if you have not included it, maybe something that you want to discuss with your city or county council, and it deals with the responsibility of permittee. We have a provision in the code which indicates building permits shall be presumed to incorporate the provision that the applicant's agent, employees, or contractors shall carry out the proposed work in accordance with the approved plans and with all requirements of this code and any other laws or regulations applicable thereto, whether specified or not. No approval shall relieve or exonerate any person from the responsibility of complying with the provisions and intent of this code. Since our code is publicly available and we expect everybody that comes into our jurisdiction to abide by this code, just because something is neglected from a set of plans or a permit that is approved by our jurisdiction shall not be construed as a free pass to do as they wish. As I mentioned, there is a new bulletin, relatively new, that the Building Standards Commission posted on their website. It is Information Bulletin 14-2. This updated the previous information bulletin that the BSC had on their website dealing with local amendments and findings. What's interesting on this is that they do make reference to their website, which now has a whole new page, which I'm going to get to at the conclusion of this presentation, which has a lot of useful resources. As I mentioned, if there are any green building standards that you guys are considering to adjust, or if you're planning on amending anything in the energy code, if it affects energy efficiency, you are legally required to have that certified by the California Energy Commission. A lot of people have contacted me and asked, how do I go about doing that? So I've included that in this presentation. It's done directly through the Energy Commission. Mr. Joe Lawyer, very, very helpful individual over there at the Energy Commission, can walk you through the process if you would like. But basically what it does is it starts with a submission of a package to Joe through the Energy Commission, and it just needs to include certain components. There are basically 6 things that you do need to include. Number 1, you do have to include an application cover letter to the executive director. Number 2, include the agenda from your public meetings in which your amendments which affected energy provisions were introduced to the public and ultimately adopted by your governing body. I included a staff report with the agenda item. I included a final action letter summarizing the results of that public hearing that went to our Building and Fire Commission. And that was the meeting at which they made recommendation to our City Council to adopt it. I included a copy of the ordinance, which actually approved those amendments for our community. And then most importantly, item number 6, I included a cost effectiveness study which identified why my amendment that dealt with energy efficiency was considered to be cost effective and should be certified by the Energy Commission. So you do need to include a cost effectiveness study. In our particular case, I utilized Michael Gable from Gable Associates as my consultant, and he did perform a cost effectiveness study for the item that I was dealing with, which we will see right here. This is actually the conclusion of it, most important part. And basically what a cost effectiveness study does is it takes a look at what the cost of construction would be with and without your proposed amendment. And if it turns out that your proposed amendment is going to save energy based on the cost of energy in your particular region of the state, if it is effective, meaning if there will be a reasonable payback, then it is deemed to be acceptable by the Energy Commission. So in this particular case, for our community, we have a provision which requires radiant barriers on roofs as useful energy savings features. And what this cost effectiveness study did was it determined, based on the manner in which a radiant barrier works and based on the anticipated cost savings for certain model buildings, it determined that there would be a simple payback in terms of how much energy was saved in anywhere from 7 to 16 years. With an average payback of 11 to 12 years, depending on what type of building was being used. We are in a climate zone in which that's a pretty reasonable payback period, because the new construction of a house, you expect a building to last well beyond 11 to 12 years. And so therefore, the conclusion of the consultant was that it was effective, and this was submitted to the Energy Commission. Ultimately, what happens is the Energy Commission will take a look at your package. They will take a look at the cost effectiveness study. If they determine that the proposed amendment does indeed save energy for the state of California, and it does so in a manner which is cost effective, so it does not unreasonably place a financial burden on the applicant, what they will do is they will certify it. And this is a copy of the certification that your jurisdiction would receive. And that's it. As I mentioned, there are some wonderful resources that go over everything that we talked about, from justifications to the actual amendments. If anybody has any questions, feel free to contact me at this information, but let's go over some of those resources that are available. Before we do, though, talk about the codes. As I mentioned, you don't need to wait until July 1st until the California codes are available. You can actually purchase the I-codes right now. They are available through the ICC website. If you have a copy of these codes and you go to the Building Standards Commission website and you express the final express terms, by marrying those up, you can actually have a copy of the California Building Standards in your hands today. And by doing that, you don't need to place yourself on that timeline closer and closer and closer to January 1st. You can start your code adoption process right now and get a head start and give yourself more time. The Building Standards Commission has done a wonderful job in making even more resources available to all of you now. If you go to the website shown on the screen, it includes some additional resources. On that page, you will find a link to download a guide for local amendments and filings of building standards. That guide has much of what we just covered today, and a little bit more detail if you're interested. If you go to that site, you can also take a look at current ordinances that are on file. Every single jurisdiction that amends their code, as I mentioned, are required to file those amendments and the justifications with the Building Standards Commission. If you are interested in what one particular community might be doing, you can go to the Building Standards Commission and take a look at the current ordinances that are on file with their office. Related resources, once again, the guide is there. This webinar is available through a link on the Building Standards Commission website, so you can view it again. Or if there are others that did not have the opportunity to view this, you can share this link with them. And then contact information for the Building Standards Commission if you have any specific questions unique to your jurisdiction. The Building Standards Commission has more resources at this link shown on your screen. If you go to this page, you will find the guide to Title 24 based on the 2013 edition of Title 24. This will probably be updated once the California Building Standards Code is published. Guide to maintaining your Title 24 is available there. There are a number of Cal Green publications that are useful for jurisdictions that can be downloaded from the Building Standards Commission site. How to use the Building Standards Commission website, there's a link for that. What's on the CBSC web? It's your building department. And then guide to filing permit surcharge fees. Those green building standard fees that all jurisdictions are required to charge the surcharge for. If you have questions on how to file those fees, there is a link on the Building Standards Commission site. And with that, thank you.